Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Secret Origins of Mint Condition. I am one of your hosts, James, and joining me is Joe.
Hey, folks, how you doing?
And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see we are joined by somebody else today, but I want to give him a proper introduction. So we are joined by a editor for a DC Comics who's worked on such projects as Injustice, Infinite Crisis, the Riddler series written by Paul Dano, Star Trek, Green Lantern, Spectrum War, Wonder Woman. I'm going to go on and on and on, but probably the most special thing about this is that this is an old friend of Joe's who has found the podcast and reconnected with him, which is why this podcast exists. So I'm very happy, honored to introduce Jim Chadwick to you.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome aboard, Jim. This is great. This is really fantastic.
So Jim, thank you for reaching out on YouTube. That's how we got connected. And I have to ask, how did you come across the podcast?
I really don't know. Oh, wait a minute. I think maybe I was having some conversation with somebody online about Joe.
You mentioned
Joe,
Kevin Bolger?
Yeah, a guy we went to high school with. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, at some point, because we talk a lot online, and your name came up. It's like, oh, hey, I said, I haven't heard from Joe in a long time. And then Kevin's like, oh, I found this podcast. So Kevin sent me the podcast. And of course, I was, glad to hear you were alive and well and
thank you
doing this. Because, a lot of times you look at people from the old days and the news is not so good. So, I was really a pleasant surprise. So I just started checking it out, listened to it. And I think you guys do a great job. It's a really entertaining podcast. And, so it was just a lot of fun. And I just thought, hey, I'll just jump in the comments here and reach out to you guys.
No, I appreciate
you did.
Yeah, I'm so glad you did. And I'm sure some of our audience members want us to jump right into your, long career at DC, but I want to take some time to reminisce since I'm kind of learning about this. So how did you and Joe meet? Joe, either one of you, what's the history and background?
Go ahead, Jim. You could do it together.
Yeah, well, Joe and I went to high school together in Bishop Loughlin High School in Brooklyn, New York, and that's where we met. And Joe might not even know this, but Joe was kind of responsible for me reading comics and being in comics because people probably don't remember this. Well, now it doesn't make any sense to anybody, but back then, comics weren't cool. If you were reading comics, it was like you get picked on, you made fun of, And I don't know, I think when I was about 12 or so, I said, I'm giving up comics because, that's kid stuff. I can't do that anymore, and then I stopped reading comics. But then I went to high school. It was in freshman year. I met Joe, and we had this class where we had to do some sort of presentation on something. And Joe, at the time, they had just released, it was Spider-Man number 96. It was the drug issue. It was the first time a Marvel or a DC comic had gone out without the Comics Code approval. And because Stan, and I think it was Gil Kane, they did this story where they showed a kid, and it wasn't putting drugs in a favorable light, but you weren't allowed to show drug use at all in comics under the Comic Code. So it was like an anti-drug story, but they still were like, no, you can't do this. So it became very controversial. And Joe did a talk about this in the class, And I'm sitting there going, it's like, wow, this guy, he doesn't care. He's here talking about comics, and what is this? A Spider-Man story with drugs in it? And then I was staying over the weekend at my aunt's house in Brooklyn, and there was a little candy store in the street. And I said, I gotta go find that comic, because I'm not in my hometown. Nobody's gonna see me. I can buy this comic and I could sneak it back and read it. And then I just got hooked again, and then all of a sudden I went out and started buying more comics. And then Joe and I connected on that, and then Joe was catching me up on all the stuff I had missed in the couple of years I wasn't reading comics anymore. And I think Joe even told me about the first comic convention, which I ever attended, because that was something that just seemed, what's that,
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was the very first Creation Con.
November 1972.
71.
71. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and what was really bizarre, a few years ago, I went back to New York for New York Comic Con, and we stayed in that New Yorker hotel. That's where so it was just so oh my God, here I am, over 40 years later, I'm back in the hotel with my very first comic convention. Of course, they had refurbished it and it was, all fixed up and all that stuff. But it was just so weird. It was so full circle, that suddenly it was like, oh, here I am. I'm back where it all began again,
That's
But,
amazing.
I draw my straight line back to Joe on that. And then, from there, it was like I never left, and then I just became hooked on comics and, built a collection and started going to conventions all the time. And, that's how it all happened. So,
Wow.
You mentioning that, Jim, now that brings back, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that talk that you said I gave, I think that was in Brother Michael's class.
I can't remember who.
Because I think he was tasking us to find relevant things to talk about and to think out of the box. Because I remember he was always that way. Think out of the box, guys. Think out of the box. So I'm thinking out of the box, comic books, and you're right, Jim, because I'm afraid when I got up there, I thought, are they going to stone me because I'm talking about comic books?
Well, and if you remember in that time period, there was this whole wave of like relevance in comics, remember?
Yes.
And I remember there was a cover story in the and I kept it for many years, but I lost it. The cover story in the New York Times Sunday magazine. It was sort of like, pow, zam, bam, comics get relevant.
Yep.
And they showed on the cover, it was a Sergeant Rock cover where this soldier had slaughtered all these innocents. And it was sort of like a takeoff on the I don't know how many of your listeners remember this, but there was this incident that happened during the Vietnam War called the My Lai massacre. Yeah. And so this was sort of like they were doing a spin on this in Sergeant Rock, but of course setting it in World War II. But in the inside, it had all this stuff about like Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and, just all this stuff that was going on in comics. So, but that was great to me because it's like, oh, see, this isn't kid stuff anymore. I can read these. These are made for adults. These are made for college kids, But that was a big deal back then in '71.
The Avengers cover with all the female characters having just obviously knocked off all the male characters.
Oh God, I forgot about that one.
Women's lip cover, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah. So.
Or remember because we used to joke about this one at DC too. Remember the one where Lois Lane turned black, where she went into that machine and she came out? Yeah. And it was like, wow, talk about like that's a relic of the time,
Yeah. I still have that comic book. I still hold my comics.
I can't remember the title of it, but it was
called I Am Curious Black.
Okay.
As a riff on I Am Curious Yellow.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, that was a big deal back then. It was a big deal.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Comics had grown up, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
They age and change with the times,
Yeah.
They always reflect the times,
Yeah, I mean, can't do any of that stuff now, but I guess at the time it was like a groundbreaking sort of way for them to like,
Well, I think that's the thing with pop culture.
Like that.
Pop culture should reflect the times and should also push the envelope. Good or bad, it should push the envelope. I think that's part of what pop culture is about.
And if it's going to end from time to time, it'll get controversial. And
exactly.
That's what it is. It is what it is. Yeah.
So to kind of just, with the timeline, so Joe getting you back into comics and you got into comic collecting and everything. So what drove you actually to pursue comics and as a career?
Wow. So, that's a long and winding road. So Joe knows this from high school. Like I always thought I was going to be a comic artist. That was like my dream growing up. In fact, Joe and I and this other friend of ours, Robert Ionata, we used to publish a comic on a mimeograph machine at Bishop Loughlin. That was like
I should have pulled those out. I still have them.
Oh God, I haven't seen those in decades. And so they used to write it and I drew it. And then we would stay after classes and we'd run the mimeograph machine there, which, talk about ancient technology, purple ink and all this stuff. But I always made my own comics. I wanted to draw my own comics. And then, after school, I just sort of, it never really went anywhere. I just felt I wasn't, I don't think I was really good enough. I mean, I tried submitting my work and it wasn't very good. And then I kind of fell into a career of doing graphic design. And for like the 10 years or so after I got out of school, that's what I was doing. Occasionally I would do like illustration work, like spot illustration work for magazines and newspapers and stuff like that, but not really big time. And then it was just amazing set of circumstances. And it doesn't make any sense to me today. It would never happen today. But in 1990, there was a guy who was on staff at DC who actually was somebody I knew, this guy, Richard Bruning. He was their design director and he left the company. And somehow I knew DC editor Mike Gold through a couple of friends of mine who owned a retail store in Connecticut. And I was talking to him one day and they said, oh, Mike Gold was in here. And he said, there's a job open in a DC that maybe you might be interested in. And, okay. So I talked to Mike, and Mike explained what the position was. And I had a graphic design background, and I knew comics and all this. So he connected me with Dick Giordano, which was pretty amazing, and I talked to Dick on the phone. I said, I would love to interview for this. And he said, oh, it's great, but I'm on my way to Chicago. I'm going to a convention in Chicago. And I said, well, I'm going to Chicago too. Maybe we can meet up there. And so we did. And that was a really funny story, because anybody who knew Dick knew that Dick was very hard of hearing. And so we had this little meeting in a coffee shop in the hotel, and Dick was, bellowing, because that's what he had to do, and I could see people walking by like, who is that guy that Dick Giordano's with, and he's talking to, and obviously about a job, because, he wasn't being quiet. And then the strangest thing happened to me. It was like, I went to that convention, I was living in, outside of Philadelphia at the time. And my ex-wife and I, and a friend of hers, we made the trip in the car. We drove across country, and we did this. And then I met with Dick, and we're driving back. Well, we got into this accident on the turnpike in middle Pennsylvania, where I don't know how we walked away from it. It was just this freak accident where the friend who was driving the car lost control. It did this 180 spin. How we didn't get hit, I don't know. The ladies were freaked out, and I was just like, I'm driving the car now. I said, I'm getting this job. Like, we survived this, and I know I'm going to get this job, And then I went to New York and met with Dick, and so I mean, the thing that blows my mind about this is, like, I was completely unqualified for this job, and it never would happen today. It would never happen today, because Dick just went on a gut feeling. You know what I mean? We talked about the job, and he seemed to like me, and I think he just wanted to work with somebody he knew he can get along with, and he hired me. And it was like, today, if you did that job, is like, or you interviewed for that job, there'd be like 10 people you'd have to interview, and it would be discussed endlessly by committee, and they would go over your resume with a fine tooth comb, and Dick was just like, oh, here's the guy I want to hire, and that was it. And that's how I ended up at DC, like this long, like, weird path that I ended up in there. But then I can go on. Is that okay? I mean,
no, that's fantastic. I mean, I'm just amazed. Like, I always hear people who work in the industry talk about, like, just what you said, like, everybody kind of finds their own path into comics, and then once someone finds that path is closed to no one will get that same path. Like, it's like there's no one could hear your story, and like you said, they're not doing it that way. No one could like enter the business the way you entered the business.
I mean, people will ask me all the time. They'll go like, well, how do you become an editor in comics? It's like, I don't have the blueprint. I don't know. I can tell you. Because that was the second part. So basically, I'll try to recap as quickly as I can, but I was at DC for about 3 years the first time in the early 90s. And then things were getting kind of rocky, both at the job and in my personal life, and things weren't really working out. And then I had actually a relationship with these guys from Malibu Comics, which was like a little startup on the West Coast. In fact, going back, even before I started DC, I drew a 6-issue miniseries from Malibu Comics. Wow. Called The Liberator, which go dig that up and see if you can find it.
I think I have found that.
Yeah. And well, first of all, what that did was drawing that series made me realize, okay, I can never draw superhero comics. This is killing me. I can't do this. This is too hard. I never want to do this. This is too much work. But anyway, so I had a relationship there with those guys. And then they were getting all this funding. They had started their partnership with Image Comics, the early Image Comics, because Malibu actually launched Image. They had the infrastructure to get Image off the ground, but it also put a lot of money into their coffers, because if you guys remember that from the early 90s, I mean, it was ridiculous. They were selling millions of comics and all this stuff. So then Malibu decided, well, we want to start our own universe. We're going to like hire all these writers and do our own thing. And they were expanding the company, and they said, we need an art director. Do you want to come out here? And it was just perfect timing. And I just said, yeah, sure. And so I moved out to California and joined them. And then a year later, we were bought by Marvel. And
right.
and then so this is hard to believe for anybody now who, is under a certain age, but back in the late 90s, Marvel was a mess. I mean, there was no Disney, there was no Marvel couldn't get a movie made to save their lives. I mean, it was just and they went bankrupt. They went bankrupt. And so a year after they bought us, we were gone. We were out of business,
Wow.
And there I was out in California and kind of drifted around. And so I left. I was out of business for about 10 years. I worked. I did a lot of freelance graphic design. I worked for a toy company called Applause for about 4 years.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Which was great because I got hired there because they just had signed a license with Marvel. And the woman who hired me said, "Oh, great, comics, you can work on this stuff, And then that went under and I left. And then, so this is weird how I get back into DC Comics. Because I never lost touch with DC. I left them on great terms the first time I went there. I even had talked to them at one point in the late 90s about coming back, but it didn't work out. But anyway, so in 2003, I got a job offer to be creative services manager at a video game startup in San Diego. So I went down there, worked for that place for about a year or so. Meantime, DC had bought Wildstorm, Jim Lee's company, in the late 90s. So they essentially had this satellite office in San Diego. And a guy named Hank Canals, who was an editor at Malibu, after Malibu shut down, he went to Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers needed somebody to run the studio out of La Jolla. So they hired Hank, and Hank moved to San Diego. Ended up moving into the same apartment complex that I was living in at the time. So weird. And I met him, and he was there, and he started, he was working there. And then he reached out to me and said, because I was the video game company went under, I was out of work again. Now what I'm going to do? And he goes, "Well, I have 2 openings for editors here if you want to come interview." He goes, "I know you've never done editing before." And I'm like, "Yeah, but I've been around comics for years. I know how it works. I've have working relationship with editors. I know a lot of the talent." And I got hired back, and it was like, and it was really funny because, in 1990 when I got there, Dick Giordano went to Paul Levitz and said, "I want to hire this guy." And Paul said, "Okay." And then 2005, Hank goes to Paul Levitz to say, "I want to hire Jim Chadwick." And he's like, "Okay, if that's what you want to do." And then I was back at DC. I was back at DC on the West Coast. That I was so lucky because, I had a great second act, which, a lot of people don't get. I was already in my late 40s at this point, and I reinvented my career. I was able to start all over and do something different. And I took to it immediately. I loved doing it, Wow. And then, so what happened, just to cut to the present quickly. So we were there for a few years, and then there was all this restructuring and consolidation. They closed the San Diego office. We moved up to Burbank, so I had to go back to LA again. And then about 4 years after that, they closed the New York office, and then everybody from New York moved to Burbank. So then we were all under one roof. So my joke was, people would come to me and go, "Oh, did you move here with DC?" I said, "No, DC followed me."
That was one of the questions I was going to ask you. You just answered it.
I said, no. I didn't come here. They followed me, to the West Coast. So. Yeah, and then I did that up until last year, and I just, it's a whole nother story about making my decision and retire and stuff. But so I got to stay there like 18 years, and finally decided to retire and moved to Spain, which is a whole nother story, and here I am now. So.
Oh, wow, that is incredible.
That is some road. That is a winding road, long and winding road.
And you've worked we've had on this podcast before writers, we've had a couple artists, but you're the first person who's been in the editorial position. So you said you've never done editing before. So what was that like, figuring out how to become an editor?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because when people talk about editing, well, first of all, when you lived in LA and you go, "Oh, I'm an editor," like, "Oh, you mean film?" No, that kind of editor. No. But for most of people, they think of literary editors, right? They think of book editors. And they think the job is you're just sitting there reading manuscripts and making notes all day. But for a comic book editor, that's maybe that much of the job. And sometimes when I describe the position to people, they would go, "Oh, that's sort of like being a producer." And I said, "Yeah, that's really kind of it." Because I had done a lot of project managing before, so it's a very similar kind of skill because, you know, as an editor in comics, you're hiring the talent, you're setting up the schedule, you're meeting deadlines, you're working with a budget. You know, you have a whole team you have to manage: writer, penciler, inker, colorist, letterer. You know, and your job is to make the trains run on time. You know, and at the same time that you're trying to give creative input. And I also think, being a guy with an art background, and Joe, you know, from the old days, it was not unusual for people who were artists to become editors. There were people like Dick, like Joe Orlando, Joe Kubert, you know, there's
Carmine Infantino became publisher.
Became publisher. So there was a long tradition in comics that comics had gotten away from, you know. But for me, I felt there was an advantage because I could, I'd spent many years like studying screenwriting and stuff. So I could speak to both the writers, but I could also speak to the artists. You know, and you know, I understood the process that they went to. So all this experience I had in the past that never worked out for me, it still gave me a lot of insight into how the job was done. You know, and it was great because, you know, I would, on the one hand, I would be dealing with people who were veterans doing this for years, and it's like I'm not going to tell them how to do it. But then a lot of times I was working with young, inexperienced artists, and I got to mentor them, which was also great too. That was the flip side of the job, you know. And you know, for the most part, I have to say, you know, people in comics are generally great. I mean, they're, you know, you read horror stories, and look, everybody runs into bad people no matter what job they're on. But by and large, you know, I say most of my working experiences were pleasant. And also, you know, the thing as an editor, you have to be a little bit of a therapist too, right? Because you're dealing with all these different kinds of personalities, and then occasionally somebody's having a crisis, and, you know, and you have to kind of manage that. And maybe, you know, somebody can't finish the job, and then you got to find somebody else to do the job, you know. So you have to bring all kinds of skill sets to it. But again, my path was a little bit unusual because usually the way it works is somebody gets hired at like an assistant level, and then they're there for a few years and they get promoted to associate, and then maybe they'll be a full editor, and then there's like a senior editor, and like where I ended up, where I leveled out, was group editor. And that's like as far as you go until you start going up into vice president positions and all that stuff. But so I kind of cheated because I came in like it as a full editor, you know, because of my background and experience and what I'd done. That's, you know, that's how they brought me in. Although the funny thing was, when I first started at DC as an editor, I was editing manga. They had a Japanese manga line, and called CMX, and that's a whole different skill set because you're not working on the stories. You're getting these imported stories, and all you're doing is having the type removed, and you're hiring somebody to translate the scripts and then somebody to re-letter them, you know. But that was a great way to get my feet wet and, you know, start going from there. And then once the manga line started going downhill, then they put me on the Wildstorm books. And then, but I was always kind of like this go-to for whatever odd project came along, editor. It was sort of like I was never that deeply involved in the main DC line. It was always like whatever was on the, you know, periphery. It was like, well, you know, Injustice was a perfect example of that. You know, like we want to do this comic based on a video game. Oh, you guys did, because we used to do lots of comics based on video games, and then, you know, so I ended up doing that. So, and even the thing most recently with Paul Dano, that was another one. It's like, oh well, you know, they actually had an editor assigned to that, but she left the company for another job, and they said, well, you could do this, right? I'm like, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing. This is the kind of thing I do all the time, right? So,
well, that's a great. Actually, you just brought that up because that was something Joe and I were talking about in terms of asking you about once we had you on, was like the Riddler book with Paul Dano, which I admit I didn't have a chance to read yet, but I'm very intrigued by it and it's on my Hoopla list to read. But so that project you came to, is that like a project that Paul Dano comes to DC with? Does DC go to Paul Dano? Like, how does the interworkings of like having like a celebrity sort of, or an actor want to write a book about a character they've already portrayed?
Yeah. So again, that's one of those things that there's a variety of reasons, but in this specific case, I can tell you exactly how it happened. So Dano is one of these guys who, you know, comes from this sort of like method acting background, right? So when he has to do a character, he gets inside the head, and so apparently when they were filming the movie, like he kept just telling Matt Reeves all these things, like saying to him, you know what I think this happened to Edward's character in his past. I think this happened. And then after a while, Matt Reeves apparently just said to him, you know what? It sounds like this could be a comic book. Like, would you be interested in doing that? And he goes, oh yeah, that's interesting. And so Matt Reeves, who directed the Batman movie, he called up Jim Lee and said, hey, Paul Dano wants to write a comic based on the Riddler character he did. And so they said, yeah, sure. But again, the weird thing about that was coming out under DC's Black Label. I wasn't in that group. I was at the opposite end of the spectrum. I was doing like graphic novels for middle grade readers and young adults, but they were kind of shorthanded, and they said, you know, do you want to do this? And I said, yeah, sure. Sounds like fun. And so the groundwork was already underway when I jumped on board, although nothing had been written yet. It was just like a lot of notes from Paul, and there was no artist selected at the time and stuff. And you know, he was great. I mean, we started doing Zoom calls together. Really, really sweet man, you know, very pleasant. He had like he didn't have like any kind of like celebrity attitude or anything like, oh, I'm a big star, you know, you have to defer to me. We just formed this partnership and, you know, had a pretty easy working relationship. Although I do have to say he was very, very concerned, like, about making a good comic. Like, he didn't want it to be interpreted as, oh, here's some Hollywood actor who thinks it'd be fun to write a comic. It was like, he did his homework and he was telling me all these things that really impressed him in comics and his vision of it. But it was a difficult project in that he didn't want to write a script. You know, because I said, you know, he goes, no, he goes, I want to. In the old days, we used to call this like the Marvel method, because right, because you come up with a plot and then you give it to the artist, and the artist just breaks it down, and then you know, and
back to Stan dialogues. Yeah,
it was sort of similar to that, and then the tricky part was finding an artist on it, because you know, Paul had this list of all these superstars he wanted, and of course nobody was available, and it was this. This European artist who had been sending me stuff, and named Stefan Subic, and who never worked in America before, but he's done a lot of stuff in Europe. And then coincidentally, I found out, like, on Maggie's list of potential artists before she left, his name was on it. And he had submitted, totally independently, unrelated, a couple of Batman pieces. And I really felt like it had the mood for the series. And I sent it to Paul, and we had some back and forth, and yeah, he's like, yeah, let's take a chance on this guy. Let's go. You know, it was big risk. Like, nobody had worked with this guy before. We didn't know, but my God, he saved our asses, because he was like a machine. He was so great. And so what would happen is Paul would send in basically like a 5-6 page outline with tons of notes and things. And then I would read it, and we would talk about it. And he always have like these alternative, like, well, maybe here, instead of doing this, we do this and whatever. And we would finally get to a point where it was more or less ready to go. And then we'd send it to Subic, and Subic would just break it down. Like, he would just send it to these rough pencils. He would actually show, like, here's where this page is going to break. Here's where that page is going to break. And then from there would be enough dialogue in Paul's outlines that I would actually make the physical script. I would sit there, look at Subic's layouts and go, okay, page 1, panel 1, page 2, panel 2, you know, and then plug in the dialogue, and then send it to Paul and say, hey, here's how I think this should go. And then he would come back with me, and he'd rewrite lines. And one of the things about it, though, he's like a super minimalist. Like, that was like the biggest not disagreement, but we would go back and forth. I would say, I don't think this is clear. I think you need a caption here. Or I think you need another balloon here or something. Oh, I'll think about it. And the next day he'd be like, nah, I don't want to do that. or we would haggle over like one line of dialogue or something. And because he was so conscientious, you know what I mean? And then like we agree on something. And the next day I get an email from him, and he'd be like, no, I don't want to do that now. so it was very challenging. I don't mean to make it sound unpleasant, but it was a difficult task, just because of his method, the way he wanted to work. And it's very unusual. Like, I rarely worked like that with anybody else. And of course, it was one of my final projects at DC. So it was like, okay, well, there's a good way to.
I could imagine, Jim, on set, him being a method actor. That's probably what he did to the director, right? I
Probably.
don't want to say that line that way, or my character wouldn't
I'm
say that
sure.
line.
I'm sure.
So yeah, so it sounds like a wild collaborative process, because you just answered about 5 of the questions I had about how someone who's not quote unquote a scripter comes to an editor or comic book company. So I have an idea for a comic book. How do you get that off the ground if he's not a professional writer? But apparently, you've explained exactly how much the editor is important
in this case. But what's unusual is he actually wrote and directed a movie.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, there you go.
So I'm like, I'm wondering, how did he do that? Like, was there no scripts? Did he just get the actors on set and say, here, just do this? I don't know, but I thought it was really funny. I thought it's funny he didn't want a script. And what was really funny at the end of this whole process, he said to me, "Yeah, I don't think I'll write another comic book." I was like, "Oh, I hope it wasn't something that I did." I hope it is.
Yeah, right. Now you got to think, "Oh, what did I say to the guy? Oh my god!" Oh, well, I'm sure he's doing okay. I'm sure he's doing well.
You know what? And he was great too, because like when I left DC, they had given me a card where everybody signed it, but a lot of it was done digitally, like people, because a lot of people were remote, so they were just sending stuff in, and they got him to write something, and they put it inside my retirement card, which was really sweet.
That is really cool.
Yeah, and then I met him a couple of times. Like he came to San Diego Comic-Con, he came to New York Comic-Con, and we met face to face there. But we had a lot of video calls that just went on for hours and hours. So. Yeah.
For our listeners, I'm thinking now, who are some of the bigger names that you got the opportunity to work with over the years? Something you recognize?
God. Well, let me think about it. I mean, one of the projects that I did that went on for a really long time, but I was really proud of it because we won an Eisner, was Jill Thompson's Wonder Woman graphic novel.
Oh.
Wonder Woman, the True Amazon.
Right.
We worked on that like for years and years, and it was difficult. It was a long process because, Jill kept getting interrupted with things, and all the bosses would be like, "When is this thing going to get done?" And my job was just to clear the runway for her, just say it'll get done when it gets done. And so when we went to the Eisner Awards, I think it was 2017, and got the award for best graphic novel, it was really satisfying because it was like all this work, it paid off, And then, on Batman 66, I got to connect with a whole bunch of people.
I think you might be mentioning this one.
Yes, I was about to mention that.
I only read it last month. It's hysterical. I loved it.
So that was the Kevin Smith and Ralph Garman one. Yeah. And that was really great because I don't know how well people know. Ralph was for years a disc jockey in Los Angeles. So he was kind of a local celebrity there. But I think he's a Philly guy originally. But anyway, he loves the old Batman TV show. He's like he was friends with like Adam West. And,
wow.
So he went to Kevin and said, "Oh, can we do this? Can we do this?" And then Kevin was able to use his, sway at DC to get it done. We were already working on the Batman thing, but then Kevin came in, and that was really funny because Kevin was a really sweet guy. Like, he came into the office, like gave me a big hug, and we went off and but I have to say, to be honest, most of the work on that was Ralph, because it was Ralph's passion project, and he just, he just loved doing it. But the other great story, Batman 66 story that I have is, and I don't know if you remember this, but we did a special edition because apparently back in the 60s, Harlan Ellison had written a Two-Face.
Right.
And it was never used. It was too edgy or something for the show.
The TV series at the time, yeah.
Yeah, and so there was some kind of deal that happened years later, like with DC, that DC made a deal with Harlan. I can't remember what the other side of it was, but it basically like, okay, we'll do this, but can we adapt your script? And he said, okay, yeah, and we did it. So this is a funny story because my regular writer on Batman 66 was Jeff Parker, and Jeff Parker was great, and he loved this stuff. So I was going to just assign this, we made a deal. I assigned it to Parker and said, yeah, let's do this. I get a call one day at the office, and it's like, hey, is this Jim Chadwick? I'm like, yeah. He goes, do you know who this is? And I said, I think I know who this is. Well, it was Harlan Ellison. It was
Oh,
Harlan
wow.
Ellison.
Oh my
And
God.
Harlan Ellison was like, he's like, listen, okay, I really, really want my friend Len Wein to write this. And I was like, oh, crap. I just told Parker he's going to write this, right? I said, well, let me see what let me see what I can do. He's like, give me Jeff Parker's number. I'm going to call him.
Oh,
So
God.
I got the phone. I jumped on with Parker immediately. I go, Harlan Ellison's going to call you. And here's what's happening. And Jeff was great. He's like, yeah, I'm not going to fight this. Like, you know, if Harlan wants Len to do it, we're going to let Len do it. Of course, we're going to let Len do it, you know? So, and then, you know, and then Harlan was like, I just got to tell you, you're a mensch, you know, and I feel bad because Harlan was like, oh, you can come to my house sometime. And I never did. And then of course he passed away, but that turned out to be a dream project because we had, Jose Luis Garcia Lopez draw it.
I love his work. God, he's such a legend.
And the thing was, I had never worked with him before. And it was like, oh my God, it was like going to comic school. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like Len turned in like a classic script, breaking down Harlan's thing. And then you saw how Jose did his thing. Like the storytelling on it was like masterclass. I was running around the office telling everybody, showing everybody, it's like, look at this. This guy has still got it. He hasn't lost a thing. He hasn't lost a thing. And so it was like, I had this all-star team. And then like Joe Prado called me up and he goes, oh, I heard you have Jose drawing this. Can I ink it? It's my dream to ink Jose. Wow. And I said, sure, let's do it. And then of course, then we got Alex Ross to do the cover, you know,
like
because
who's full of the industry.
it was just such an amazing project. And that was like one of those ones I just sat back and it's like, okay, this train's rolling and I'm not going to mess with it, you know? Right. And it was great. At the end of the day, it was great because I was so glad, you know, in hindsight, especially because Len passed, Harlan passed, you know, and it was a great opportunity to have all these guys do it. But yeah, that was. I
love that book. I have a copy of his gorgeous comic book.
Yeah, and of course, Alex did all the covers to the Batman Green Hornet too.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, that's a good. That was I just finished reading that. That's a fantastic book. You working with Kevin Smith and Alex Ross and
Alex was bummed though because so the weird thing with Batman 66, there were certain characters we had likeness rights to and some we didn't.
I know which one you didn't.
And it was Gum, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Gum. Yeah. And so I think Ralph came up with this idea that like, well, he was in some accident. He has actual gum all over his face now, you know.
Kind of like Baron Zemo.
Yeah. But, you know, when I had to explain this to Alex Ross, he's like, well, this is terrible. Why are we doing this? You know, it's like, look, we don't have the rights to the guy's likeness. We can't, you know, we can use the character. We can't.
The actor was Roger C. Carmel, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, Roger C.
Those are beautiful. I mean, Alex Ross's, the covers for that is beautiful. I mean, everything Alex Ross.
Here's my favorite cover, the one with the two cars.
Yeah. Yeah,
because that's my favorite car of all time. The 66.
And again, you don't art direct Alex Ross, especially on this stuff. And it was weird because Alex had a working relationship with Dynamite Comics, and he's not a computer guy at all. So he would have them do all the scans. So somebody at Dynamite would always send me the scans. Well, it was a co-publishing thing because they had the Green Hornet rights, so we did that together. And these scans would just show up, and it was like, I got nothing to say. It's just gorgeous. This is like gorgeous. Right. What am I going to say about this? It's absolutely gorgeous, you know?
Wow. That's great. Cool. Since we're like one of my favorites that I didn't realize that you were editor on until I was researching is did you do the Batman Ninja Turtles crossovers?
I did, yeah.
Oh, wow. I love both of all three of those volumes.
Okay, so I got great stories about that too. So there were two versions of it, right? Like IDW did like the kids version of it. And we did the more like grown-up version of it. And the thing was, we had been talking about this deal. So Freddie Williams, who was the artist on that, right? I had worked on, I think it was on the Infinite Crisis series based on the video game. Freddie had done some things for me. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, he sends me a bunch of Turtles drawing. He goes, hey, I see you're working on a bunch of crossovers because we've been doing the Green Lantern, Star Trek stuff and all that. He goes, if you ever do anything with the Turtles, I'd love to be considered. And he had no idea that we were already planning this. And I just looked at Freddie's work and it's like, oh my God, my job is done. Like, I don't have to talk to anybody else about this. This guy is just, he knows this because, you know, I really am not, I don't know the Turtles that well. and have a guy on it who's really passionate about it. And then, of course, we got James Tynan, who was also another guy who grew up loving it. So these two guys, they knew everything about the Turtles. I couldn't tell them anything about it, you know. And I would just let them run with it, you know. And they were a great collaboration because, you know, James would write a script, an actual script. Freddie would just blow it up, and he would break down the pages any way he wanted to. And James and I would look at it and go, yeah, that's great. we're gonna do that. And then the other fun part of that, well, first of all, we had like 1 million covers done for it, but we also had Kevin Eastman did like variant covers for us, and he was oh my God, he's such a sweetheart. Like I met him through this project, and he was so gracious and so kind. And I think I met him at San Diego Comic-Con after that. He was just so tickled that we were doing this project. He just thought, and he was so like, oh my God, I'm so great. I get to do covers with Batman, you know? That was just such a fun project. And it blew up. I mean, we ended up doing 3 series altogether because it was so successul, you know?
They're all great. I enjoyed reading. I grew up with the Turtles, and obviously I love Batman. And I was like, wow, this is fantastic.
Did you get the omnibus? Because that thing came out, and that was
no, I didn't
like
get the omnibus.
I was
I love also the sketches that are involved, like everything. I was just like, wow, this is a fantastic book.
I mean, Freddie was so passionate about it. Like even before we started collecting, he goes, "Look, I have all this stuff you can put in the collection," you know. And yeah, it's great. All of his development sketches and everything was just, it was a blast. That was a really lot of fun series to work on.
Yeah, wow, it was great. And then the other book you just mentioned that I recently just read in preparation for this, that actually just blew me away because it's such good storytelling, and then the art was the Star Trek Green Lantern Spectrum War. That was fantastic.
Great stuff.
Yeah.
That was
okay, so I feel bad about saying this. We did a couple of those, and I can't remember which ones actually I edited or IDW edited.
I think the one that I read was the Kelvin universe.
Okay, yeah, because the thing with those intercompany crossovers, sometimes DC would handle the editorial, and sometimes the other publisher would handle the editorial. So I think with most of the Star Trek crossover stuff, that was done by whoever was at IDW doing it.
Okay.
So I did that, and so my role in that kind of thing was just kind of an approval thing, right? Cool. Like that. Oh, here's the story we want to do. What do you think about that? And of course, that was more complicated because then it has to run through Paramount, right? Because Paramount has to approve everything. Well, actually, same with the Turtles too. Everything had to go through Nickelodeon. But we were lucky because our approval person at Nickelodeon was an ex-DC person. So it you know, and she had very, very minor notes for us. But with the Star Trek stuff, so for me, I would just look at it and go, yeah, we really don't want to do this with our character, or, you know, so, but it was always fun with this stuff that I got to work on. We were outside of continuity. So we were able to get away with a lot of stuff. You know what I mean? It was just sort of like, well, yeah, maybe we wouldn't do this on an actual book in DC continuity, but who cares? We're in some other playing field, and
in the Kelvin universe, you're different.
Yeah. So we can just have some fun with this, you know, making Captain Kirk a Green Lantern, or, you know, But I don't think I wasn't really that much hands-on with those particular series. Again, my role was just to review everything, see everything coming in, give DC approval on it, you know, and let.
So Jim, was there anything that was because we had this discussion with Michael J. Friedman a few times with Paramount and Star Trek. Was there anything that was already drawn or already put in place that they came back and gave you notes on and said, no, you can't do that? Did Paramount ever give you trouble like that?
Not to my recollection, and I think probably most of that ran through IDW.
Oh, okay.
Although I will tell you this, when I worked at Malibu, we were doing the Next Generation series for a while. We had rights to that. We were doing that.
I remember.
And the running gag was every time we would send something in, we would get a note back from Patrick Stewart's people saying, my head's too pointy and my nose is too bulbous.
James, that's the Michael J. Friedman when the haircut.
Yes.
Picard's haircut. Yeah, he had the same problem with that.
Yeah, we got that note came in on almost every issue, I remember.
Oh my
I
God.
guess Patrick Stewart's very conscientious of how he looks in comic books. He's always on it.
Apparently so.
I mean, the likeness thing is a weird thing because you never, like, some people get very picky about it. Some people are not involved. Like when we first started doing Batman 66, all the stuff had to go through like Adam West people. I don't think we ever got a note on any of that stuff, you know?
Yeah. Well, when you're doing like projects with like, you know, Batman 66 or Star Trek.
Yeah.
Is the intention that the artist is always supposed to like make it look like the actor, or at a certain point they're just supposed to embody the character? Like, what are you looking for as an editor?
That's a great question because it actually does vary by project. There's sometimes where we don't want to do an exact likeness. We want to evoke. In fact, on the Riddler series, Paul Dano was very specific about that, which was hard because he says, "Oh, I don't want it to look like me." Well, you put the glasses on, you give him the haircut, like. It's going to look like him, right? There's no way to avoid, because there were some things he would want us to change because he goes, that looks too much like a likeness of me. But like, for example, so one of the projects I had edited was we did a comic adaptation of Django Unchained, the Tarantino.
Oh, right,
movie.
yeah.
And Tarantino was real specific about it. He said he didn't want it to look like the actors. He wanted to sort of live in its own continuity. And that was slightly problematic. Another Alex Ross story, because I got Alex Ross to do a variant cover, but I told him, hey, it can't look just like Jamie Foxx. And he was like, well, I don't want to do it then. Because he goes, if it comes out and it doesn't look like him, people are going to think I did a bad job. That like I tried to make it look like him and I couldn't do it. So we cut him some slack. And we said, okay, fine, make it look like Jamie Foxx. It was a variant cover. So, but yeah, some of the stuff you deliberately shy away from making it look like the person. And then some of it you don't, like with the Batman 66, like whoever we had the rights for, we definitely wanted it to look like those people, you know?
Yeah.
Because that was the fun of it, you know?
Oh,
yeah. I mean, I guess that it could also span to a broader, like as an editor, when you're choosing an artist and stuff like that, how, like, when you pick an artist, I'm assuming there's their style. So like, is there any like rules in terms of like how the characters come out, if they're too stylized or too far, like, is there like a character template? You're like, this character is like, you're not really representing this character the way.
Yeah. That's an interesting question because I've seen that evolve over the years. Like it used to be sort of the conventional way of doing these kind of things in the old days was that you would find artists who are really, really good at likenesses, but they were maybe not the most exciting artists, you know, but you would use them because they would get the faces right? But you could tell they were just using heavy photo reference on everything, you know. But that was the demand. That's what was required because it would go through an approval process. You have to make sure they all look like the people they were supposed to look like. But I saw that evolve over the years where people are more interested in just, look, let's just make it a good looking comic and try your best to make it look like the person it is, or maybe not make it look like them, you know, again, because it varies from project to project. But, and then it depends. Sometimes it depends on who you're dealing with on the approval side. You know, you may get somebody who's doing approval for the studio who's just like super fussy about it, you know, and they think their job is to noodle everything. And then you maybe get lucky and you get somebody else that's like, yeah, okay, this is good. And they just, you know, will rubber stamp it. So it varies from project to project, company to company. Depends on who you're dealing with, you know.
Wow.
Many, many years ago, and I don't know, James knows this, and I like to name drop Len Wein because he's my favorite comic book writer of all time, and I just adored his work. And Len Wein took over the Gold Key Star Trek comic, I think around issue 7 or 8, maybe 10. And before that, none of the characters looked like they did on the TV show. Scotty had blonde hair. And if I'm not mistaken, it was an Italian artist, and he had never seen the TV show. So when Len took over the book, the first thing he did was he sent him model drawings of the Enterprise, of the characters, models of the actors, so that now all of a sudden they looked somewhat like Shatner and Nimoy and Nichols and Doohan, and so it and the book took off, and it just sold very well from that point on. But back
isn't that wild? Because I think back then it wasn't like that in comic books. Who cared, right? So it doesn't sound like they were running it through anybody on the Star Trek side for approval, right? Or they weren't paying attention, because it wasn't a concern back then. It's like, oh yeah, those are just comic books. Who cares?
Yeah, it's just impulse buy for these 8-year-old kids, and that who cares? Right? Yeah.
But Joe, that reminds me, we did a Star Trek comic for our high school comic that we did. We had
We
one
split,
issue.
we split Spock in two, I think.
I think we did. Yeah.
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 And I remember spelling Sulu incorrectly, and we showed it to Len, and Len said, "Oh, okay, but you got Sulu's, you spelled Sulu's name wrong," and it was just.
I got to ask this question: how did we spell it? Because that's such an easy name.
We spelled it with two L's, Jim. Sullu.
Sulu. Mr. Sulu. Oh my God, that's so funny. I don't remember that at all.
Oh God, yeah.
Do you still have that comic, Joe?
Yes, I have all 3 editions of Gallery Comics.
I've moved.
Jim, Robert Ionata, and I were the first ones to team up Batman with Mr. Miracle before DC ever did it.
Yeah,
that was
that's
issue
right.
1. Issue 2 was, I think, Robert Ionata's take on
Night Gallery.
Night Gallery.
Yeah.
And then issue 3 was the Star Trek comic,
Star Trek,
where we had Captain Kirk and Spock.
I've moved so many times over the years that I don't have those. I'm glad to hear that you actually have copies of them.
Well, Jim, I have something else here I want to show you.
Oh my God.
And you know what? I had these for the longest time, and I actually found that somebody is selling these on eBay.
Oh my God. Like, are they getting a lot of money? Oh yeah.
They want $50 for this one.
Get the hell out.
Yeah, and here's
well, you know what? Because I don't know if that Neil Adams drawing has ever appeared anywhere else.
I don't think it. I think that's why. Because you look, it says Neil Adams, and this comes up.
Yeah, with my ugly logo that I drew by hand.
That's
God, it's embarrassing.
Beautiful. Oh, and then here's the second issue.
Yeah, that's Rosetta, right?
That's Rosetta. Yeah.
Where did we get that from? Did we get that from Joe Parenti? Or was that
Joe Parenti? Right, the store in the forest. So this was an original though from Neil, was it not?
I think he did it for us.
Yeah.
He did it for us.
He did. Wow.
Yeah.
So
holy cow!
So this was a fanzine we did.
Yeah.
I think we were both seniors in high school at that point.
Yeah, we were working with the Mancuso brothers, Ralph and Frank.
Yeah, and their father owned a printing company,
Mm-hmm.
so we got like a discount deal through their father to do this. You know, we put our shekels together and probably what seemed like a really break the bank fee back then. It was probably maybe $50 between all of us or something.
Interview with Neil Adams.
Yeah.
We interviewed Adams. We interviewed Len and Mauve. We interviewed E. Nelson Bridwell.
Yeah.
That is incredible. Those are going to be those are episodes, audience. I'm going to get them from Joe. He's going to put them together so he can send them to me. I can read them, and maybe Jim, maybe you can come back. We can reminisce. Once we all have a copy, we can.
At some point, I want to say I had possession of the audio tapes that we transcribed those interviews from. But maybe they went back. Maybe they went back to Frank. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember because I did a lot of the transcriptions on those, and because I don't think I ever actually went to any of the interviews. I think you did it.
Yes, the first interview was Len, and then Marv was gracious enough to sit in, and we did that interview at a McDonald's across the street from the McAlpin Hotel.
Oh my God. And then I would take your recordings of them, and I would sit at home and with my tape recorder, listen, stop, type it out, listen to the whole transcription of them. Yeah.
Technology, isn't it great?
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
70s technology.
Yeah. Hey, we made it work.
I tell Joe all these stuff you tell me is incredible. It's Joe is always I'm mining Joe for more stuff that we could talk about on the show. And I'm this is incredible. You did a comic book, you did a fanzine. This is.
Well, the comic book. Well, you're not going to see that. That's I can't. No.
Well, Joe. Now, come to think of it, we go full circle here because I think Outlooks was probably my first editing job.
I think we have you listed as editor in chief.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
Let's see. Where are the editor in chief? Jim Chadwick.
Oh my God.
Assistant editors Ralph Mancuso and Joe Peluso. Publisher Frank Mancuso. And it was the 4 of us. So we each had a title.
Yeah. Yeah, yes. That was crazy. And I did a lot of spot illustrations in those too.
Yes, you did. Yeah, you did. Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Oh, man, that was good stuff. Working in the, it was in Brooklyn, like you said. But good, very good times. Now, there's another person I wanted to ask you about who you may have worked with at your time at DC, because this is a person who worked also at Barnes & Noble, and that's Joey Cavalieri.
Oh, yeah.
You know Joey, okay.
Yeah, I know Joey. Joey and I never really worked that closely together because Joey was in New York. I don't think Joey was on staff when I was on staff in New York in the early 90s. I want to say maybe he was at Marvel at that point. And then he came back to DC at some point in the 90s. And by that point, I was in California. So when I went back to DC in the aughts, like 2005 or so, I think he was still at DC in New York.
Okay.
So we would occasionally communicate, but we were never really working on projects or anything. I mean, we knew each other, but wait. So did you say he worked at Barnes and Noble at some point?
Yeah, he worked in. We were the grunts that worked in textbooks, right?
Yeah.
And then we had the people that worked in the front, the more cultured people who worked in the trade department. Joey was one of those people. Who was more cultured than we were.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had no idea he worked for Barnes and Noble. That's crazy.
Yes, he did. Now, it's another name. I don't know. I think this was after you had left Barnes and Noble, but Keith Williams. Did you ever work with Keith Williams? Keith did it. Yeah, he did a 10-year stint on the Phantom.
Yeah.
For Lee Falk.
No, I never worked with him, but I knew I know the name of him. I knew he was. Yeah.
But I remember we worked together, I think, from 84 to 86. And he also worked with John Byrne. He was the background inker on a lot of Byrne stuff on Man of Steel. And
that sounds familiar. That sounds familiar. Yeah.
So a lot of alum, comic book alum, come out of Barnes and Noble.
I had no idea.
Brian Postman also worked at Barnes and Noble.
Wow.
Brian did some work for Marvel back in the day. Yeah, and that's something, right? A lot of talented people.
Yeah.
No, I'm not one of them. But you guys are very.
That's not true. That's not true, Drew.
Okay.
So, well, Jim, I kind of because I'm an artist, and I recently went to a convention, got to speak to Jim Shooter for a few moments, and he gave me some artistic pointers because, like, I'm still an aspiring artist, and my goal one day is to, like, maybe have something published for DC or Marvel down the road. But I'm still working on my craft. But what would you say to, like, artists to get them better? Jim Shooter recommended the book Art for All It's Worth as a book I should look at. I'm curious what your advice would be for artists, because I never get to hear editors really talk about the process of, like, you said you mentored artists and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, and indirectly, it's kind of how I ended up in Spain, but a lot of times I would go to conventions and my job would be to sit and look at portfolios. More recently, it's a thing DC stopped doing at conventions just because, first of all, it was an enormous time suck and resources. And then plus what we started to find in the internet age, or at least this was my opinion on it, is that the really good people would find us online somehow, right? Mm-hmm. And they would figure out how to submit things. And all the people we were starting to see at conventions, these people would show up and go, "Oh, I just found out you were going to be here, so I drew these 6 pages last night." Well, you can imagine how good those 6 pages were, you know. Yeah. And it's like, well, why aren't you drawing all the time? You know, you should have had 6 pages ready, right? But anyway, my point being, a lot, you know, I would go to conventions, and well, in the early 90s, it was a nightmare because when Image Comics came out, everybody in the world wanted to be a comic artist. And I would go to a convention, I'd sit at a table, no exaggeration, for like 6 hours, this nonstop line of just everybody in the world wanted to be a comic artist. But it sort of thins out a little bit more. But I enjoyed that part of it. I really liked talking to people about their artwork. And it's, you know, I've never seen your work, so I don't know how to evaluate it. I mean, some of the stuff I don't think you have to explain to people. I mean, it almost became like a running gag. It's like, okay, work on your anatomy, work on your perspective, you know, because inevitably people would not be doing that, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where my background as a failed artist comes in. And Joe, I think you'll appreciate this sports analogy, because I always found, for me, the best baseball managers were not the stars.
That's right.
They were always the guys who rode the bench, right? Because they were
backup catcher.
And the stars, I don't want to say came easy to them, but they were on another level. So them, they would just be like, well, why can't you play like me? You know, it would be that, right?
Exactly.
I assume, right? So for me, it was like, I can get inside people's heads and I could hear the excuses, right? Like, it's like, oh, I'm hearing my voice come back to me from the past. I know what you can't fool me. I know what you're doing, you know, because I would always kind of, particularly if they weren't showing like a lot of development or ability, I would just say, you know, how much time do you spend drawing? And it would be like, oh, you know, do that. I said, look, all the people who make it in the industry, they're obsessed with drawing. They draw all the time. If they didn't get paid, they'd be drawing. You know what I mean? It's like all they do. And it requires a lot of sacrifice. And that's why I didn't make it, because I didn't do that. And, you know, literally, it's like Well, you like playing video games? Yeah, put that aside. Can't do that anymore. You know, oh, do you like to watch movies? Well, maybe you can have them on the background, but you've got to be drawing constantly. You've got to have that sketchbook. You've got to be practicing. You got to constantly be improving your skills. And that's what you would always find. The people who didn't make it, they didn't have that passion. You know, they didn't have that. It's almost like an obsession, you know, and unfortunately, because it's a very, very competitive field and only a very small percentage of people get in, it's those people who do the work who get in, you know. It was funny because I had some years ago, I don't know if you know artist Pete Woods, you know.
Sure.
And I worked with him on a project. One time he told me, he goes, you know, you looked at my portfolio back in the 90s. And I was like, oh my God, what did I say? And he said, no, you gave me great advice. And, you know, apparently what I said to him, it was one of those really long lines. And I saw some ability and I said, well, turn around, and look at that line. I said, 99% of those people are going to give up and they're not going to make it. And if you want to do this, just stay focused and don't give up. And, you know, he said that was good advice, right? So, yeah, it's, you know, the advice I give varies on whose work I'm seeing, like how far along they are, you know. You can see, obviously, if you see people who have no ability whatsoever, and I'm not a harsh critic. Like, I don't enjoy crushing people's dreams. I don't like to be, you know, because used to be a lot of these old timers just like, no, I just got to tell you, you suck, you know, because that's the only way you're going to get good. I would just never do that because I know how painful it is. But I would just try to get inside their heads and say, what is it that you want to do? Why do you want to do this job? Like, why do you think you want to be a comic book artist? How much time do you spend drawing, you know? And the really hard ones for me were the guys who I would meet and they'd be much older and they're still drawing at the level that like I was drawing at in high school, you know? And it's like, you know, that's a tough one. I don't think you're going to make that leap, you know? Not that I want to be ageist about it, but it was just sort of like, you haven't been doing the work, you know? My funniest portfolio story, it was like, this was back in the early 90s, right? When Image is blowing up. Everybody, like every portfolio I see, somebody's trying to be Todd McFarlane, right? Like all these Spawn ripoffs and all this stuff. So this guy, I was at a convention in New York. This guy comes up to me, like very clean cut, button down, white shirt, tie. And, you know, he's probably in his like late 20s or something. And he shows me his portfolio and it's like, it looks like it was drawn by like a 6-year-old. I'm not exaggerating. And I don't know what to do with this guy. And I said, so what do you do now? And he goes, oh, I work on Wall Street. And I said, well, why do you want to draw comics? He goes, well, I read that Todd McFarlane became a millionaire. So I thought I'd try this.
Stay on Wall Street. You might be
like, I don't know what to say. Stay on Wall Street, you know. It's just, you know, that's like my funniest story ever, you know. And it was really rare that I would hire anybody on the spot. That's the toughest thing about it because you know everybody you talk to, what they want is you to say, you're fantastic, you're hired. Like, here, I got a script for you now. And that almost never happens.
That's like an 8-year-old saying, well, I think I'll take up baseball because I want to be like Derek Jeter.
Exactly. I use that a lot. I use sports comparisons a lot. I said, look, you know, it's like an athlete. You from the time you're like young, you got to be out there working at it every day, putting in the hours, putting in the time, you know. It's not just
Tiger
talent.
Woods. Yeah, Tiger Woods, 3 years old. His father had him out there. By 6, he was beating grown men.
Yeah, it's not just, look, talent is a factor, you know, because I've met a lot of people who it just comes to them naturally. They're really good at it, but they don't make it if they don't have the discipline, you know.
Yeah.
And then we could probably rattle off a list of artists like who are really great. And then people are like, well, why isn't that guy drawing a monthly book? It's like, because there's no way on earth that person can draw a monthly book. They just can't do it. It's not, you get like one book a year out of them and you're lucky. But, you know, then there are people who are really good and they turn out like clockwork. But, you know, I have a friend of mine who lives here in Spain and he's an artist for DC. I never see him. Like he's just hunched over the drawing board. He's just over the drawing board, like all day, you know. I go, hey, King, what's going on? Let's go out and let's have a drink. Oh, I can't. I got a deadline. I got to get the book done this week. So, okay. Wow. So, yeah. But, you know, if you want to shoot me your work at some time, you know, so I'm not avoiding your question, but the thing is, it's hard to give advice without seeing the person's work, right? Because it depends on a skill level and where you're at and all that other stuff, is that I sort of know how to address it. So because it's you run into such a gamut of things, of work level, and everybody is a different story. But I think all the basic stuff everybody should know, right? And I always would tell people, like, if you see people, all they're doing is copying comics, it's like, put the comics aside, draw from real life. You got to do it. And, or the other one, and you get guys, everything's a pinup. Everything's a pinup of a superhero posing. It's like, you know what? 90% of stuff you're going to draw in comics is going to be people standing around talking. And you got to make that exciting too. You got to make that interesting. You're going to have pages and pages with people wearing civilian clothes. They're not going to be in skin tight costumes. You got to make that look pretty, and that's a challenge for most people, doing stuff like making fabric and making it look natural when somebody's wearing a suit. Yeah.
What you're talking about, I was watching a video the other day. Graham Nolan was talking about Jim Apparel's artwork. He thinks he's very underrated, and I agree with him.
I absolutely agree.
Showed this panel, a couple of panels from a Phantom Stranger book, and he just said, "Look at this. There's no action, but there is action in every panel, even though it's heavy dialogue and exposition." And he pointed out things that I've been reading comics for 55 years I never would have thought of, and it's just, and of course, Apparel was an immense talent, and I don't think he gets enough credit.
No,
but you're right. It's more than just being able to draw anatomy. Obviously, there's so much more to it. Yeah.
Well, and if you want to go, of course, to the other extreme, I think of Kirby a lot, because I could open up a comic and there's no action. The characters are just standing there talking to each other, but it's freaking dynamic. It's like exploding off the page, and it's just like a couple of characters standing there talking to each other, and you're looking at it. It's like, my God, this is great.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've discussed this multiple times. James knows this. That Kirby's is my all-time favorite, but I adore the work of Joe Kubert. I think he was a master. I just love his work. Kurt Swan, because of Superman and the Legion, but Gil Kane.
Well, and Joe, there were all these guys back in the day. They were sort of like the more journeyman guy who, over the years, I've come to appreciate them more. Like a guy I never really appreciated, like when we were teenagers, was like a guy like Ross Andrew. And I go back and I look at Ross Andrew's work now, and it's like, my God, this guy was great. This guy was just turning the stuff out every month, and it was great.
Andrew and Esposito, they were together for years. They started their own company in the 50s. It didn't last too long, but we've talked about that. How I didn't appreciate Kubert at the beginning. I didn't appreciate Andrew at the beginning. But you're right. When you realize what they're doing, you're just like, your mind is blown. Oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah, well, and when these guys all came out of like a different school, right? They were all like craftsmen. They were like, a lot of those guys didn't even set out to be comic book artists. They wanted to be like commercial artists, advertising or something. It's like, okay, I'm working on comics now, right? So they brought that whole skill set with them.
There's that whole Milton Caniff school, Frank Robbins and Alex Toth, people like that who just I didn't get Alex Toth when I first read his stuff.
I think if you want to get more modern too, like another example I think about was Darwin Cook, right? Because to me, Darwin Cook came out of nowhere. Like when he started doing stuff for DC, it's like, who is this guy? Like he was like full blown superstar, and then you realize he had like worked in animation for years before he ever went into comics. So he had a whole skill set that he brought with him.
He was a master storyteller.
Yeah, he wasn't like some guy starting at 22. I don't remember exactly how old he was, but he was a veteran by the time he started in comics. So it's like full blown. It's like, whoa, like where'd this guy come from? Like I never heard of him, and now he's like, one of the best in the business. But you don't really get too many cases like that anymore, because most of the people who are drawing comics, that was their goal. That's what they set out to do, from day one.
Currently, now, are there any particular artists now that you enjoy that you think are going to be superstars? Are superstars?
What I'm kind of proud of? Like when I was doing Injustice, I was really like, we started that as a 10-page weekly digital series. And that was, digital was, weekly was tough, even only 10 pages. Because if you think about it, like a comic is 20 pages a month. So 10 pages a week is 40 pages a month, right? Wow. So I was constantly having to find artists and shuffle them on them. And I can never get the top talent. So I was using like all kinds of people who were available. But I noticed several of the guys who I started working with are now big stars at DC. Bruno Redondo was one of my steady guys. and he's fantastic now. I'm so proud of where he's come.
I love his Nightwing book. Yeah.
Beautiful book.
Danny Samperi, who's drawing Wonder Woman now. He started out with me on Injustice.
Wow, that's right.
You know?
Oh, that's right.
And I actually gave Jorge Jimenez his first job at DC. Wow. I was doing a comic based on the TV series Fringe.
Oh,
and I got Jorge to do like a 10-page story on it. And, you know, so I was really proud of seeing these guys who like nobody was using them on the main DC books, but I was using them on all this Injustice and other stuff. And so now to see these guys become stars is like really, really satisfying for me, you know.
Yeah, oh, hey, Menace, his work is incredible.
Yeah, he's incredible.
He's just grown so much. It's just like his development has just been phenomenal. But in terms of I know I'm going to blank on this now too, though. But yeah, I mean, I see people all the time now. Unfortunately, you know, because like I'm retired now, I don't get the comps anymore, so. Oh. It's a little harder for me to see stuff, but you know, I'm always amazed, like how many good people there are, you know, and I'll pick up a comment. It's like, oh, who's this person? Where'd they come from? And of course, I'm blanking out on any names now. I can tell you, but
I'll throw one at you. Dan Mora.
Oh, Dan Mora is fantastic.
Yeah, we love him. Yes.
Oh my God, he's fantastic. Yeah, I never got to work with him, but yeah. He's another guy. Like, where did he come from? Right?
Exactly. He just burst on the scene. He just
burst, and it was like, you know, he's like a star immediately. You know, his work was so great. You know?
His work on World's Finest with he's working with Mark Waid. His work on recently on Shazam was incredible. Absolutely.
Yeah. Because frankly, Shazam was never a character I had that much interest in it. But with Dan Mora drawing it, it's like, oh, I really want to read this book.
Yeah. No, I think an artist that whose work you appreciate will draw you to a book. I think it's a visual medium, so you know
it really is. Yeah.
As we talked about, Joe, that's how I kind of I was looking at comic books for a long time before I started reading them. I mean, you know, it was,
I think we all started that way. Yeah.
You know, Jim Lee's X-Men #1. I was like, I looked at that book for a long time before I like started reading those books that I was collecting on a monthly basis. So
it's weird the way it shifts though in comics history. Like sometimes it's like the artists are the stars and then the writers are the stars. I think there's been like a feeling in more recent years the writers have been the stars. Because I know I've heard a lot of complaints about this and I agree with it. Like you read a whole review about a comic and they'll barely mention the artist. And it's like, come on, like,
exactly.
You know, the artist contributed to your experience of this. It wasn't just sort of like a guy wrote all the words and, oh yeah, this other person just filled in the blanks. You know, it's like, if you like that comic, chances are the artist had a lot to do with that too. Because, you know, and that's funny too, because I don't know if you guys remember this, but we did, I don't know, 2010 or 11, we did these flashback series. It was between when they closed down old DC and then they started New 52. And there was this period where there were like no other books coming out and they assigned all of us at Wildstorm to do these flashback books where we were doing like versions of DC comics from the 60s or 70s, 80s, and 90s. Right?
Yeah, I remember those, yes.
And I put back together the Justice League team of Giffen, DeMatteis, and Kevin Maguire.
Right.
And I had never worked with those guys before. I didn't know how it worked. And I never realized like what a contributor Kevin Maguire was. He wasn't just drawing pretty pictures. Like all the acting was coming from him. Like Keith, the way Keith would do a script is he never typed a script. He would do like a 9-panel grid with little stick figures and then tell you what's going on in there, and then send it to Kevin, and then Kevin would just blow it all up, completely do it different. And I freaked out the first time Kevin like turned it in. I go, this is nothing like what Keith did. He goes, this is how we work. Don't worry about it. and then it goes to DeMatteis, and DeMatteis would see what Kevin did, and he would write, you know, of course, to Keith's plot, but to Kevin's acting too, you know. And that to me was like a great example of how much like a collaborative team, when they're working well together, really works. Because, you know, all those bits that you used to see in that JLA, so much of that, it wasn't on the script page. It came from Kevin Maguire.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, James, we were just talking about this morning. With Keith Tarnowski, I called him up to see how he did during the earthquake, and somehow Maguire's name came up, and we think he's the king of facial expressions. You know, you don't need a word balloon or even a thought balloon to know what's going on in that character's mind. And McGuire was the type of guy, he would stay like a director. He would stage the characters, and you knew from the way they were standing and moving, you knew what was going on. Beautiful storytelling, and just yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why that team worked together so well too. Because then DeMatteis would pick it up, and a lot of his dialogue would be driven by what he saw Kevin putting on the page.
Yeah, they were like a theatrical group staging a play, but on the comic book. Yeah.
But that was always my best example of what like an artist can bring to the page, and why I think in the business they sometimes do not get enough credit, or they're just sort of glossed over when you're reading a review of a comic somewhere.
Yeah, you gotta take the time to like just look at everything. Like when you're reading a comic book, just look at the page. Like this is like you're reading through the dialogue so quickly and you turn it, but that's someone spent hours doing that one page. Right?
Yeah.
And, to quickly dismiss them like that is like it's a shame. Or
sad. Yeah, it really is.
I'll pull out my Marvel Epic Edition volumes 1 and 2. It's all the Steve Ditko, and I'll just marvel at what he did. In that era back then.
We were just talking about with Richie, like looking at George Perez, anything George Perez, like how much detail is in a single panel of like
crazy.
He's got 8 panels on the page, and each one is like its own page.
I don't. That guy must have never slept. I just don't know how else he could have done it. I just don't know how he could have done it. And more of the comics back then, like 24 pages or something,
At least, exactly.
Yeah. And then every page he did had like a dozen panels on it or something. It was insane, and every book had like 40 characters in it. It's just nuts.
Yeah. Crisis on Infinite Earths. And then of course the JLA Avengers 4-part team up that he penciled. Yeah. Who wrote that again? That was Kurt Busiek. Okay, yeah, right.
Busiek, yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's amazing. All those characters. What a trooper. What a my God.
But that's also like the ultimate George project, right? JLA Avengers crossover, of course.
It started back, I think at one point in the 80s, and then it fell apart for whatever reason, I don't know, and then they finally got it off the ground again some years later.
Yeah.
But those are some of my favorite comic books of all time. Beautiful work.
They're luckily coming back into print for the omnibus. So
yeah. So it was a long time coming too.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Jim, I don't know if it's a fair question to ask you. You can decline it, but what's like your favorite project? I guess project you're favorite and most proud of with your tenure.
I was anticipating this question, and there is really no one project, and that's the honest answer of it. I mean, I have to say probably the thing I'm most noted for is Injustice, and because of the nature of that and how we had to produce that and everything. Look, Tom Taylor was absolutely amazing. Our quality was, it wasn't always the A game all the time, although, everybody did their best work on it. But that was like lightning in a bottle. Like it was one of those things like, we're doing this based on a video game. Nobody cares. And I had worked with Tom on like one other project, and I said, how about I hire this guy? And it just blew up. It was like this runaway train. And so, I'm really quite proud of that. The book I mentioned that I did before with Jill was like a big victory. I just was really proud of that. I mean, and that was all Jill. I mean, I had very little input into that. My job, I said, was just to get everybody off of her back. Like when they were saying, we got to get this book done. It's just like, it'll get done when it gets done. And, Batman Turtles was fun. And I have to say, I have a book that's still coming out that I'm really proud of. One of the last things I edited is coming out, I think, in the beginning of June. And it's a YA graphic novel called Barda. Big Barda. And it's written by this young creator named Ngozi Ukazu. And Ngozi was noted for, she had one of the most successful Kickstarters in history. And it was a web series that she did called Check Please. And then it was published as, it's all about hockey. And it was collected and it sold great. So when we started up the YA line, she and her agent came to us and we really want to work with her. And she pitched us on 2 ideas. And one idea was Lois Lane, and the other one was the Sparta thing. And my boss at the time and I were like, oh, we should probably do the Lois Lane thing. That's going to be more commercial. But in the back of my mind, I'm going, I really want to do the Barta thing because I love that stuff. You know? And then finally she came back to us and said, no, I really want to do the Barta thing. And the thing that was amazing about it, I thought I knew that Kirby Fourth World stuff, but she like knew it inside out. And what's great about it is a perfect example of how you can do a YA version of these characters and be incredibly faithful to the source material, you know? And because she kind of makes it like, it's a little bit of a love story. She has like a different angle on it. Like in the beginning, like Barta has a crush on Orion, but you know, they're mortal enemies. And then she's in charge of breaking Scott free. And then she falls in love with Scott during the course of this and helps him escape from Apocalypse. But I would, you know, get on video calls with her and we would just geek out about Kirby, you know, like we were just talking about all the, and, you know, Joe, that's my favorite stuff. And I always wanted to do something Fourth World related. So I felt like just as I'm going out the door, I get to do a Fourth World thing. But I also did in 2017 for Kirby's 100th birthday, Dan DiDio wanted to do like a whole bunch of Kirby related things. And he wanted to volunteer. And I was like, I'll do it. So we did like these Kirby specials with all this different talent. Like Howard Chaykin did one and Keith Giffen wrote one. And that was a lot of fun. That was a lot of fun because that was like a heart thing for me, right? That was like, you know, oh my God, I get to do something to honor Kirby, you know, and that was great. But yeah, the Barta book, I'm really, really proud of it. It was mostly finished by the time I left. I mean, we worked out the story. She had penciled everything. I think she still had to color it. The lettering had to be done and all that. So that's coming out. The Riddler book, you know, I'm kind of like, that was one of those things because I described to you in great detail how we made it. I'm like, I have no idea this is any good or not. I have no objective view of this anymore. And I think at the end of the day, when I go back and go, oh yeah, you know, we made something out of this. It was good. So yeah, I would say, you know, like Injustice, Wonder Woman, True Amazon, the Barta book, the Riddler. I did so many things over the years.
I know. I was looking at your, like I said, I have to ask you, you know, as we wrap up, I just, you know, because it's my favorite character and maybe there's no story there, but you did Swamp Thing Giant series, like Giant, the 100-page Swamp Thing Giant series?
No, well, I didn't work on those 100-page Giants.
Oh, okay. All right.
No,
so there's the internet. The internet is not reliable there.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, because no, they were being done while I was there, but that was being done to a different group. That was when they launched those. You're talking about the ones they did the 100-page books, and they sort of look like those 100-page spectaculars.
Yeah, they look like the classic 100-page.
And we mainly sold those into Walmart. That was the whole
Walmart books, yeah. Okay.
Walmart, right? Yeah. So I didn't really have anything to do with those at all. No. So the internet has let you down. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And what about like the Scooby-Doo Apocalypse? Were you on that?
I think I briefly worked on that. It was like in my editorial group. I didn't start out doing that, but it was the editor who was working on it reported to my group. So, you know, a lot of I got to see a lot of that stuff. That was fun. You know, it was
the reboot of that Hanna-Barbera stuff was
I did a lot of that. Okay, so I did do a lot of that. I did a lot of those crossovers, the Hanna-Barbera stuff,
the Future Quest and the
Looney Tunes stuff.
Future Quest, that was excellent.
Yeah, I worked on a lot of that crazy stuff, and it was just those were like, that was all Dan DiDio. He just loved that stuff, and it was just sort of like, sure, I'll do this. Well, you know, we'll have some fun with this. And some of them were really goofy, but some of them were like really fun to do too. And you know,
I love those characters, and it's always fun. Like when you guys mixed it up and changed, made them a little more adult, and made them a little more silly, and you know, and
I got to tell you, the animation people were not always happy. Like I heard there was a guy over, like the guy who used to be on staff at Warner Brothers side and would have to approve all the Scooby-Doo stuff. He hated the whole concept of Scooby Apocalypse, hated it, but it went over his head. He couldn't do anything about it, but just hated the whole idea. We just like, oh well, you know.
Well, you know, there's so many versions of these characters. I think any one of them could exist in the universe, and I enjoyed that stuff. I was surprised when DC did it, and when I picked it up and read it, I was like, this is kind of fun.
You know what? You know, one of my favorite one was we did Lex Luthor and Porky Pig that Mark Russell wrote. Oh
I
my!
never read that one.
Oh my God, that was hysterical. It was basically Lex wanted to start his own social media site, and of course there was a nefarious scheme behind it, and so he hired Porky to basically be his fall guy. Like Porky was going to be the public face of it and take all the heat on it. There was a lot of social satire in there, but yeah, it was.
I'll have to look that one up. That sounds great.
Oh my God, it was great. That was so much fun.
Oh wow. Well, Jim, you've been so generous with your time. And
Oh yeah,
I think we're going to have to do this again if you're willing to come back.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's so much more we want to talk to you about. But Joe, do you have any final questions? And
no, I think once again, James, I want to thank you for creating this podcast, because I've been able to reconnect with old friends, with Jim Chadwick, previously with Keith Williams, and of course all the people who used to hang out with back in the day in Mint Condition on 664 Port Washington Boulevard. 66. I was going to say 666, but that's Hinks.
That was the old DC office. 666 Fifth Avenue. Yeah,
Fifth Avenue. That's right. So this has been great, and Jim, it's just great to see you and to talk to you again. And you're living in Valencia, is that correct?
Valencia, yeah.
Is that on the Mediterranean?
It is, yeah.
You're lucky, man.
It's about 4 hours south of Barcelona.
Is the weather as good as I think it is?
Surprisingly, it was chillier here than I expected to be in the winter. I was prepared for it to be very hot, but the winters get cool here, and it's because people tell me it's because it's humid.
Okay.
And now we're starting to turn over, and then people are warning me. It's like, oh, the summers here apparently are like Florida. It's not just hot; it gets very humid. So we'll see. We'll see how I can tolerate it come July.
I wish you the best of luck with that. Just again, just great seeing you. Just thinking back to those Loughlin days. And,
I hadn't thought about our comic we did in high school for like years until I started talking to you. So that's wild.
Yeah. And who were some of the people we tortured? Oh, Padalino, right? We tortured Padalino, didn't we? Didn't he teach math, Mr. Padalino?
Yeah.
And I mentioned when we were going back and forth in the comments how we used to maneuver the desk around in Zemba's class, Mr. Zemba's class. Such a nice man. I don't know why we harassed him.
Well, not only that, like, what I'm going through now, because, I live here in Spain and I'm struggling with the language, and it's like, damn it, I should have paid more attention in Senor Alfonso and Senor Parra's classes. But I had no motivation back then. You know what I mean? It was just sort of like, well, I got to take a language. I guess I'll take Spanish. And now it's like, damn it. I had
Mr. Scotto and Mr. Palmento in Italian.
Yeah. Because I could really use those guys now. I got to tell you.
Well, Duolingo. It's
I do Duolingo every day. It's and I do other things too. But it's one thing to visit a place where you don't speak the language as a tourist. It's another thing when your day-to-day existence, where you can't really speak all that well. So I muddle my way through. I'm
sure you'll do well. So once again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you,
Jim. Thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to having you on again. And definitely want to talk about that fanzine, Joe. But
we'll talk about that. Yes, we will.
Now we got Jim here, so we gotta talk.
We'll do a reading. We'll do a reading.
Yeah, there you go. A reading. Yeah.
We'll put our.
No. Thanks, James. Thanks for setting this up. And again, I think you guys do a terrific show, and I'm really glad to be a part of it. So thanks.
Well, thank you so much. And listening audience, if you've enjoyed this, if you're joining us on YouTube, thank you. The YouTube channel, we try to keep up to date. And if you're joining us just for Jim Chadwick, thank you for joining us for this interview. If you liked it and you want to check out other podcasts, we have almost 200 of them by the time this releases. We've also talked to Jeremy Adams and Keith Williams and the voice of Lionel, Larry Kenny.
Michael Jan Friedman.
So we have lots of guests. And then if you're just interested in us talking about comic book back of the store stuff, we got tons of episodes on that. So you can look back the whole catalog. But as always, we like to hear from you. So if you have comments, thoughts about this episode, the Facebook group, Secret Origins of Mint Condition. We're on Instagram, Secret Origins MC. And we thank you for listening. And we'll talk to you on the next episode.